This conference will now be recorded.
And Pat, go right ahead. It's all yours.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. This is Pat Wagner with Pattern Research in Denver, Colorado. And the topic today is the micromanagement cure, using the expectations model for effective oversight. And I have to tell you that one of the best things about being a trainer is that you get to learn cool stuff. And I'm not making this up, but I was at a project management class many years ago at the University of Denver, and the instructor, a man named Bill Casey, presented the model we're going to be looking at today. And I actually leapt up from my seat and went, yes! And everyone looked at me and I had to sit down. But I have found in presenting this live for a number of different programs, particularly having to do with project management, it can be a powerful model, and I hope you like it as much as I do. We'd like to remind people that this project, this webinar, is made possible by a Library Services and Technology Act grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, administered by the South Carolina State Library. And I think we should all send them thank you letters. That's my idea. So every program I do has a key idea. And the key idea today has to do with what oversight is and what micromanagement is. Oversight is based on what actually gets done. That's an important concept and the key idea today. And it's about what gets done, meaning does it reach the goals? And we always talk about prioritized goals within the parameters and the limits of what we do. And to be able to explain this, we tell people that how this is accomplished is style. So the whole secret today is we focus on the goals, we focus on the parameters, and if people are able to reach the goals within the parameters, they can do it the way they want to within some certain exceptions. Now here's the model. And the model states a couple of things. It says that we are trying to reach, oops, got a little sound in the back. We're trying to reach the prioritized goals, meaning what are the outcomes, the results, accomplishments, what's the finish line, what's the achievements. And we'll explain what that is in a couple of minutes. Within how we do it, our parameters, how we do it. And those parameters on one side are what's sometimes called professional parameters. And those are the guidelines, curbs, limits, baseline, standards, rules. I include all of these different synonyms because when you go through the literature, different authors, different books use different words to describe these ideas. And then on the other side is what we call civility. It's about manners and respect, courtesy, and so on. And for a number of years now, in talking about personnel issues, we emphasize to everybody that it isn't just what your technical skills or professional skills are, it's also how you treat people. We have to have both in the workplace. So what we're going to do is explain why when we're evaluating the success of what goes on in a workplace, we focus on what's in the blue. Did the goals get reached within the parameters? That's what we focused on, not necessarily exactly how people accomplish that. So this model can be used in a number of different ways. The favorite way people have to use it is to actually make a printout of the model and sit it down with the person they're evaluating for an individual performance evaluation. However, it's also something if you're evaluating a group, a special project, ongoing projects of different kinds, a single event, a check-in with a team or a building, strategic plan evaluation, you can use the same model. And the way that I teach it and the way that I get feedback from people is that they actually print out their version of that model to be able to share with the people they're talking with. And they tell me there are so many ahas, why people get that you're working really hard, but you're not achieving the goals, or you're achieving the goals, but you're not paying attention to the parameters. Now, everyone has a different definition of micromanagement. And it's one of those things that you probably know it when you see it, but you don't know how to define it. So today's definition is when you focus on the how the work is done, rather than if goals are accomplished within the two sets of parameters. And I'll give you some examples today of how that works. If you have a different definition or description of micromanagement that you use, please feel free, please feel free to share it with us today. The outcomes from the program are pretty simple. Oops, need to mute that person. The outcomes are to set results that are about what the job accomplishes. And we're going to go into a little detail. It's not necessarily that the person swept the floor, because sweeping the floor is part of the job description. But what is the result of sweeping the floor? Sweeping the floor means that we have a welcoming library that people find welcoming and nice to be in because it's not dirty, there's not dust on the floor or whatever, and it says something about the environment. So we focus that on the accomplishment. Again, we focus on the goals. What is it that we're trying to accomplish rather than the methods, unless there's a darn good reason that everyone has to follow a certain method of doing things. And then finally, to provide employees with room to create their own methods. You hire smart people and then you stifle them unnecessarily so they don't innovate, they don't initiate, they don't step forward and say, okay, I will take the initiative to get this and that done, because they know that for their job, they've been told there's only one way to do it. And that's a great way to keep an organization frozen in the past. And we're hoping that out of the program today, it might inspire you to let people grow in their jobs a little bit more. So what are we going to be covering? We're going to be talking about how micromanagement wastes time and money, why it's not just about the job description. How are we going to evaluate it? So how will we know if we're successful? What are the details of what we call the professional parameters, which are things like budget, time, and quality? What about those behavioral parameters? And in the work that I do with libraries, I spend more time over on that right side, dealing with civility and how we show respect toward each other. And then how is the model itself evaluated? You know, what are mistakes that people make, and how do we tweak it as well? It's one of those things where once you get the concept, you realize the concept is easy, but execution is more difficult and takes some time. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about how micromanagement wastes time and money. So let's take a look at the expectations model and what happens when we only focus on the how, that we're looking at how people are doing something rather than paying attention to what they're supposed to accomplish and the parameters as well. So I put together some case studies. All of these are based on real events. I have changed names and details to protect the guilty, but here are several typical ways that we micromanage people and what the results are. So first of all, the biggest way micromanagement wastes time and money is we're doing everybody's job twice. You know, you hire someone to do a job, they do it, and then you come back in and you redo the job. In effect, you're paying twice for the same work. And there's other things that a supervisor needs to do. And it's very common, unfortunately, that we promote people not on the basis of their project management skills, not on the basis of their people skills, but how long they've been on the job. And when they get promoted up, they don't know how to supervise. So all they know how to do is that task that they've been doing for a long time. So they become the new head of cataloging, and all they know how to do is catalog. So they spend all their time redoing and double, triple checking everybody else's work. Where I've seen this is when you have an administrator who doesn't know how to do oversight, and they're literally line by line checking every single budget. Expenditure down to pennies, regardless of the fact that they have some very competent people. They have an accountant or an accounting firm. They have a bookkeeper. They have a purchasing manager. I know of a school board where this was a wonderful example where one of the new people on the school board who didn't know how to be on an elected or appointed board actually reviewed every single expenditure of the new superintendent moving from city A to city B, and went into his office and screamed at him because he had spent $9 for Venetian blinds at the local Walmart for the new house, rather than taking the Venetian blinds from his old house and basically hoping that 500 miles later, when he was in his new house, that the Venetian blinds were fixed. I also know a case of a library board member who waited, of course, until the director wasn't there and went into her library and screamed at the clerk in this small town library because she felt they had spent too much money on pencils. Big waste of time. I'm sure none of that has ever happened to anybody who works in South Carolina, but if you have an example from another state where maybe you worked for misguided people, maybe you have an example of doing everybody else's job. Another example is that thing I said about stifling creativity, that whole thing of people aren't allowed to solve problems. And what I find, particularly if you have smart people working for you, and I assume everybody's a smart person, people do become apathetic and cynical. You know, when people tell me about morale issues, that's one reason people like me are brought into a workplace. Oh, we have terrible morale issues. This is the first thing I look for. Why are people apathetic and cynical? You know, because somehow they weren't allowed to be their best. And of course, this affects productivity. Now, I'm not going to make this up. I've run into this more than once, but I find that IT people tend to be wicked smart. And if they're not allowed to have some leeway in how they solve problems, after a while, they don't report problems anymore. They don't report fixes. The feeling is, and this is pretty much a verbatim quote, they don't care about me and my expert opinion. Why should I care about them? So just think about all the hidden costs to not allowing people to be those folks who look for things and are able to solve problems, again, within the parameters. Then we have the perfectionist. If you have ever been accused of being a perfectionist, or in your heart of hearts, if you think you have the perfectionist gene, we can do a little Dr. Phil here, and you can report in the chat box if you've ever been a perfectionist. The problem with a perfectionist, among other things, is they tend to ignore deadlines, that pesky time-space continuum, and budgets. And so they create what I consider very unrealistic standards of quality given what are the available resources. And with all due respect, folks, libraries do wonderful work. So many organizations do wonderful work, but you're not the emergency room of Children's Hospital. If you make a mistake, it's probably true that puppies aren't going to die, for example. And so are the expectations of the perfectionist realistic? But here's the other problem is, if in assigning work or having people do work, if you have in your head that that nice Pat Wagner is going to take 2 hours to complete that really killer flyer for the next big summer reading event, and she takes 10 hours instead, that extra 8 hours is basically money that's pulled out of the budget and Pat's time that could be spending for something else. Now, I have this is actually a real story, and it is about the fact that the cataloging head, and this is copy cataloging. I have done copy cataloging. Let's all admit it ain't brain surgery. The head of the cataloging department, who was a retired academic librarian who had moved to a small town and had gotten the job of being their head of cataloging. You know, it was her retirement job, actually demanded scholarly standards for popular fiction. I don't know how you do that, but she did. And it was taking not days or weeks, but months for popular fiction that was arriving at the library to be put on the shelves because she wasn't satisfied with the cataloging. They did terminate her, which I don't think was a bad thing. The bureaucrat, and this is probably another one of these very common kind of micromanagements that we see, people who are fixated on what the rules are rather than focusing on what the outcome is. Some people, all they focus on are the parameters, particularly the professional side parameters. So all they care about is the budget. Meeting the budget is not a goal in project management. It's a parameter. The goal is what we do with the money and how we spend the money and what the money does for us to achieve the goals that they want. And so The fact that we have some people who work at the circ desk who actually think that enforcing policies is the goal of customer service is a little disconcerting. And oftentimes, if you're at the management level or administration level, you don't find that out until you're getting more and more complaints from customers or wondering why your usage figures are dropping. I worked with a library in suburban Illinois where I found out through a meeting with the administration that they had a circulation clerk who was making children cry at the circ desk. And I'm thinking, how come she's worked there more than 10 minutes? So I sort of did a little talk to them, and I just said, if I was a little kid and my parents found out that the circ desk made me cry, trust me, there would be noise about that. I'm just shocked that more parents and guardians are not complaining about this. So I don't know if any of that has ever happened to you, but I've seen these more than once. Now, okay, are there exceptions? Let's get them out of the way right away, but we don't want to make the exceptions be the rule. One thing is that you really do want a consistent customer services experience. So you may have a library that says at the circ desk, we have a catchphrase that we want everybody to use when they say goodbye to someone, because in most libraries, the only time that they actually interact with someone on the staff is at the circulation desk. So it's like, some people say, did you find what you want? Some other people say, what was something you wish that you could have found? What's something that we could do better? I mean, there's things like that. Sometimes there is a specific method that we need to use for whatever reason, and that might have to be with a safety procedure, having to do with fire drills, what kind of emergency procedures, if there's a medical incident, how we deal with children or babies in distress. So there may be something where we say, yes, this is how we do it every way. And then there's this question. I've been an employer several times in my life, and what I try to do with people is someone will come to me and I tell them, make the case to me that your way is better than what we're doing. And they tell me what, and I go, okay, let's try it out, because we have what we call proof of concept. We can argue back and forth which method's going to be better, but the truth is, until we, build the bridge, build the building, do whatever we're doing, we don't have that proof in the real world. So we might say to the person, okay, we'll try it your way for 2 weeks and see what happens. And I would say, without exaggeration, 90% of the time, my employee had a better idea than I did about how to get things done. So our workplace kept evolving, which was terrific. I kept learning from these smart people I was hiring, and it was great. But you know what? About 10% of the time, it didn't work. The overhead was too much. And we just kind of said, well, you know what? We tried it your way. Now we try it my way. I don't consider that micromanaging, but I wait to find out first how much it would cost or how much it would do to try it the new way. And you know what? What I have to watch out for, because I've been doing this a long time, it's easy for me to come up against the wall of my own comfort zone as a supervisor or manager. And the world is changing in ways that are unexpected. And I don't want to be one of those old biddies that you start putting knockout drops in my cocoa to get me to leave work because I'm so stuck in the past. But if you do an honest effort to let people try things out and you have a way of evaluating that everyone agrees upon beforehand and it doesn't work out, and then we go back or we try something different, that in itself is not micromanaging. So first thing we need to do is to look at the goals. And those are, again, we have different ways of talking about them. If you use a different word than a goal or a result or an accomplishment, that's absolutely fine with me, as long as you understand the concept that we're talking about. So why is this not just another job description when we talk about these things in the gold box that are the prioritized goals? And again, everybody has a different way of using the word. So let's kind of go through, and what I did was try to compare a job description to what the goal might be, that if we're successful at doing the job description, this is the result. So if the job description is that Pat is supposed to manage the summer reading events, one of the goals is that we intend for our community that we maintain or improve reading scores over summer. That's the goal. If that's part of our strategic plan, if that's part of why we're doing summer reading, if it's important for us in terms of educational success, it's not for every community, but it may be, then that's the goal. If I'm your webmaster and I have a whole list of technical things, I have to be reminded that my goal is to improve customer convenience, make it easier for people to do business with us, the whole library without walls concept, that it's easier to look up books, reserve books, use the different resources that we have on tap, renew books of different kinds, comment on books, reach people, understand what's going on, promote the library, but it's to improve customer convenience. For the young adult reference librarian, again, you may have a list of reference duties this person has, but the goal is better grades and papers. And if you work closely with the school district, you're able to evaluate that because when you start instituting different things in the library, you should have school counselors and teachers who you can communicate with who say, yeah, the quality of the term papers the kids are turning in is better. Of course, this is particularly true with reference librarians in academic libraries. How do we know we're doing the job? Well, what's improving? Community outreach services. I'm from an immigrant family, so all of this stuff means a lot to me, that I may have community outreach services. And at the end of the day, it's not how many um, underserved populations I connect with, are the people there developing skills, are the people who help them, the social workers or law enforcement or the school district, saying, yes, people are more comfortable here, they're understanding what it's like to live in this country, their English skills are improving, and so on. Now, this is a cliche, we all know this, right? That you may have a job description about cataloging, but the goal is to ensure access to materials, to make it as easy as possible for the people who visit the library and the staff to find the materials they need to do. Again, circulation clerk, number one thing is we want people to be welcome here at the library, that they have that welcoming experience that makes them feel they want to stay and return and tell their neighbors and friends, yep, and family that, yes, come to the library. They're going to make you feel welcome. That emotional experience is as important as how efficiently we check them out at the circ desk. If you're in human resources, there are some people in human resources I've met that all they really care about are things like getting out the payroll and dealing with insurance, which is okay. But what's our goal? It's to attract and keep quality employees. To the employees, our customers, what are we doing to help them? Are we vetting insurance policies to make sure that whatever we're offering meets their needs? Are we making sure that any changes in payroll that they know about beforehand so there's not unpleasant surprises? And again, with collection development, it's helping the user solve problems. So I hope this gives you some ideas. The fact that what we're talking about in goals is the successful outcome of the work we do and how it affects, number one, our library customers and also the staff and the greater community, our stakeholders, in other words. So if you can think about this, and this is a little exercise you can do as we're talking, and I love side chats, and it allows people to look at what you've written. When you think of your job description, what are three main prioritized goals for your job? For example, when I think of my job description here as a management consultant and an instructional producer, my main goal, I can tell you what the number one goal is to promote the success of the libraries I work for, the libraries and the individuals I work for. 85% of what I do is with libraries and universities. So no matter how well I do my job in my own mind, if my clients aren't, my customers, in other words, are not succeeding, then I'm not being successful. Then it's like, Are those prioritized goals written into everyone's job description? Do you have job descriptions at your institution that are the sweep the floor, here's the list of tasks that we expect you to do, or also included in that is what you might call the more strategic goals? Here are the 3 top things, or 3 to 5 top things that we expect that because of the work you do will be accomplished, that we can see the impact of what you're doing, and that you are sharing what your success, and in other words. Some people get very insular, very self-contained in the work they do. They forget about the customer, they forget about other people, you know, and people like me try to get people to pay attention to what that outcome is. So that's what we have to look at. So how will we know we're successful? Let's go back and take a look at those goals again. And again, if we're successful, it's about the goals within those parameters. That's the most important thing. So one of the things we have to do is to think about goals are written into the job descriptions so that when people work, they get the bigger picture. And part of the job of supervisors and managers and administrators and leaders is to, not in an obnoxious, tedious way, but in a friendly way, keep reminding people about what we're trying to accomplish here. What's the big goals that we're trying to accomplish, and to tie praise to that. Those goals should be tied to the strategic plan, which is the contract, in effect, that the library has between the director, the staff, the board, whatever your governance board is, and the community and or institutions that you serve. And so part of it is what the values and principles are by which you operate, and so on. And the goals, and this is where it gets interesting, that the goals have to be written so they can be evaluated. And this is very interesting. And this partly is one of the hardest things I face, and people like me face, when we're working on strategic planning with our libraries and other institutions, is that I want goals to be specific, concrete, and concise. So and I think of a library that I worked with in the panhandle of Texas, where it was a very poor community and the school district was not very good. So the library said, our main goal of this library in our strategic plan, our main mission and vision, is to improve the educational opportunities for the K through 12 and the adults, actually, too, because they had an adult literacy issue in our community. And by doing that, everything we do focuses on that K to 12 success. So using that as a decision-making point, they pretty much decided that they weren't going to pay too much attention to popular fiction anymore and spend most of the money that they could in collection development for their K through 12 reference section for homework and advanced placement and charter school. I don't think they had charter schools at the time, but homeschooling and online schooling and all those kinds of things. So if you were to visit that little library in that small town, you would think their collection was a little lopsided, but you know what? You wouldn't be able to read that strategic plan and know exactly why they were making the decisions that they were making. So I'm going to give you a quick rundown about 5 kinds of evaluations that we might use. And this is going to be quick because this is a large enough topic that the State Library of South Carolina should be able to send all of us to Tahiti for a week to go into it in depth. But you can find a lot of information about this, and you've probably run into this before. Okay, so we have 5 kinds of evaluations we can do to see if we're achieving the goals within the constraints. We can have metric, numeric, something tied to a number. We can have descriptive, and we're going to go through all of these in detail in a minute. Things that, and sensory specific means things that we can see and smell and taste and hear. It's strategic, so it does tie into those big picture mission, vision, principles that we find in the strategic plan. Also, it can be behaviorally based, and there's 2 simple ways to do it. What has changed for the stakeholders, the people who use the library and are directly impacted by the library, and what has changed in the greater community that we serve as well. So let's look at these in detail. So a metric would be that we were able to, and we might put this in, we might say, we will know if our new program of helping people with job hunting was successful if we were able to help 300 people find better jobs this year. Better is the operative word, and better might include that it pay more, offers new opportunity, offers opportunity for training, all those kinds of things. But that number 300 sets a standard for us to reach. The descriptive one, and this one, I was at a very large university in California, and they had made a lot of changes to the libraries. And this is one of these ginormous universities that had 12 major libraries on campus. And when I was talking to the dean of the libraries about the new successes, the first one she said, you walk into the library and it's packed with busy people from morning till night. And she took me to one of the libraries and we were literally stepping over bodies. There were so many students packed in that academic library. And she said, if you had come 2 years ago, this would have been a wasteland. It would have been a desert. You'd be lucky to see 2 students or 1 faculty member in this lobby area. And now look at it. Strategic, that we had set educational benchmarks and we're reaching those education benchmarks that we set. So that might be strategic. Stakeholders, that people come up to people in the library and say, I feel welcome and safe now. I'm so glad you have this new program. I remember one library said that we knew that our new program for teaching our library users to use the self-checkout. This was in Farmington, New Mexico, the Tony Hillerman country. The director told me that she said, I knew we were successful when I saw one Navajo grandma teaching another Navajo grandma how to use the self-checkout. And she said, I knew that that was a success. And the reports of the stakeholder about why they love the library, why they love coming to the library, what they're saying in the general public. And then the community thing. And I tell people that you know that you've achieved a leadership role in your community when the fathers and mothers that run the town, right, the elected and appointed officials, the financial decision makers, have to make a big decision regarding the town. And they call the library director and say, we want you to be there because we don't want to hold the meeting about the future of the community without the library there, because that's the impact the library is having on the community. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. And that's one of the ways that we would evaluate the success of what goes on. So what could be hard about this? The concept is simple, but what actually could be hard about this idea of setting prioritized goals? On the next slide, I'm going to review some of the things that people have told me over the years, but I'd like to hear from you, just with this little piece of information that we've presented so far about setting these prioritized goals and making sure that we focus on things that are concrete, that we prioritize them. What's more important, what's second important, and what's third important, because we want to make it easy for people to make decisions when there isn't enough time and resource and there isn't a supervisor to confer with, and they know what the priorities are, so they can say, this is more important than that. So what could be hard in your mind for some people about this whole idea of setting the prioritized goals? Oh, yes, guilt. People feel guilt. Too many priorities, right? And this is something interesting, by the way, that my mentor, Bill Casey, who's a clinical behavioral psychologist with decades of experience, even when he's working with large companies, he makes sure those main goals are only 3 to 5 of those main prioritized goals. Remember, we're talking about the outcomes. And sometimes we set so many outcomes that nothing gets done. And setting too many outcomes is a way of keeping people from accurately evaluating things. You don't have time to do everything, to accomplish everything. So it helps you focus and target. And I've sat through my share of strategic planning sessions where part of my job was to stand in front of the audience with a big red pen in my hand and cross off good ideas, cross off intentions. The fewer goals you have of these kind of goals we're talking about, the more likely you are to achieve success. Yes, giving up things And by the way, when I do strategic planning, one of the very first things that we do when I'm the facilitator is talking about what we're going to give up to allow resources, time, money, staff, all that stuff, to be able to do the new things that we want to do in the future. And I think, and I've said this before, that one of the big failings of my wonderful friends in the library community is the fact that they spend a lot of time doing things, and they're so conscientious that when given more to do, they try to put more on the plate rather than to be realistic about what resources they have. In project management, by the way, that's called overreach. And let's take a look at what people say. We take for granted what we do, and we haven't really thought about why we're doing the things we're doing. That goes back to too many things on the plate, what we have on the plate, not having set parameters. We've always done it this way. It's fascinating being in a room with people who have always done something this way. Well, I hope I'm not telling tales, but I have a story about your state library that goes back many, many years. And you folks many years ago got a new state librarian, and she found out that there was a multi-page document at the state library for making decisions about how to have parties at the state library. And I think it was 8 pages long. So this was an 8-page long document to determine how to have a party, like a staff party, birthday party, anniversary party, going away party at the state library, 8 pages. So one of the very first acts of the new state librarian, and not your current state librarian, we're going back 2 or 3 state librarians, is that she stood in front of the staff at her introductory meeting holding the document in hand, and she ripped it up in front of the staff. She said, "This is ridiculous. We don't need 8 pages. You're adults. We'll come up with a couple of guidelines that everybody agrees upon, and then this is a waste of time." When she ripped up the stuff, people noticeably gasped because that was something that had been in place for many, many years. But you know what? There was not a tear in the time-space continuum, and all life on Earth did not stop when they tore up the 8-page thing. It's insulting to have to justify what we do. And the first time I heard this was at a medical library conference in Boulder, must have been 25 years ago, where I was working with medical school library directors. And we were talking about some of these issues. And one of the women said, "I have been a medical school library director for 25 years. I do not feel I have to justify anything I do. And now I'm being asked to justify it, and I find it insulting." And I said, everybody has to justify what they do. Doctors have oversight from tumor boards in the hospitals. They have to renew their licenses. I said, I'm evaluated all the time by my customers. And it's a way of learning and growing, but it's not a way of saying you're wrong or you're bad. It's educational. You should be glad that someone takes the time to say, do this better, do this. But just saying intrinsically that you ought to be able to do your job with no oversight, I don't think works for me very well. This I've seen a lot, can cause busy people to just make up stuff because the goals don't make any sense to them. And that's something, if you're a supervisor or manager, that's like the transition period. It's a symptom of the transition period when people start to get it, to see the value, and don't take it too seriously. Everything is equally important. We have too many things. People who can't prioritize usually are really bad at making decisions. Also, it doesn't align the group to one set of goals or ideas that everybody needs to be doing as well. So these are some of the things that people have said. The guilt thing, I agree with. If you have anything else to add, please do. And let's take a look at some of the parameters. And again, we're going to start on that left-hand side, because when people talk about this model in the beginning, they say, but oh my goodness, Pat, you're just saying let anybody do whatever they want. And I'm saying, no, of course not. First of all, are they achieving the goals? But second of all, we have those parameters in place. And the most common parameters are things like budget, timelines, quality, the ethics of the profession and the field, any legalities that might be around, and also standards. Your state library, your state has standards for what they expect from libraries in the state. Most of the states that I visit have standards of different kinds that people have to go through. So let's kind of go through these things. And we have the budget, timelines, quality. Those are the top ones. We have ethics and legality, and we have the standards. So budget. When we do an individual project, like you have hired me as an outside consultant, and you say, Pat, we want you to produce a series of brochures. This is what I did in olden times. I don't do this anymore. Series of brochures for the events that we're going to be doing for the library, and the budget is X amount of money. That's the budget, you know? And so I have to be thinking about, I have to accomplish my goals within that budget. Accomplish it, meaning the budget is not a goal. It's simply a parameter. It's like a curb, a fence, saying that there's a limit. Now, what's interesting is some people say, oh, that's so stultifying to my creativity. For me, there's a different kind of creativity when you have to work within a tight budget. It's kind of fun. You have to think, let's be clever. What can we do with the limited resources we have? I love, my husband and I eloped, so I never got a wedding, but I love reading all that wedding stuff. And I love postings where people said, this is how we had a lovely wedding with no money. And they talk about all the things they did to save money and still have a really, really nice event. I love stuff like that. I'm an old hippie, so I love to cook stews and make things from scratch, and it's really fun. And yes, given a very limited budget, I know how to make very healthy food that tastes good on an extremely limited budget because I've been broke just like everybody else on the planet. So what's harder is for long-term things like what have we budgeted if we look at the budget for the library for collection development. Does everyone who work in collection development know the limits of the budget? How much we're going to spend in the coming year? What are some of the goals that we have to achieve? Like, yeah, we have to really beef up our collection in regards of things for the business people because we really want to help grow more businesses in our town. So does everyone know the budget? The budget should be transparent. Most of you work for public sector agencies. And if you work for a nonprofit agency or a private agency, you still have oversight from your donors, from evaluation from state and federal organizations. If you're a 501c3, everybody knows your budget because it's part of the requirement in being a 501c3 that you have to share with the IRS those detailed budget information that's then posted for everyone on the planet to be able to see. I want people to be able to know that. Another kind of budget issue is what we call the income minimums. And I've gotten more testy about this. I was working with a state library, not your state library, a different one. And if I mentioned the name of the state, you would say, I know that state. And we were talking about a review of their curriculum and going through the review. And one of the questions I kept asking was, this sounds like a terrific project. How much does it cost to execute it? And how many people are you reaching? And they were talking about this incredible model they had for success. That was this big deal they did every year. I don't know I can't remember if it was a leadership program, some kind of program, big, 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 big deal. And it was paid for by Institute of Museum and Libraries grant. And let's just pretend it was $100,000. We'll just pretend that. And I said, how many people are you serving every year? And they said 8. And I said, you're serving 8 people with $100,000? They said, yes. And I said, but I understand there's this other model that you use that costs maybe $10,000 to implement it, and you reach 100 people every year. They said, oh yeah, but that's not a good model. Okay, do you hear the little perfectionist thing in there? And I said, this other model you're doing is wonderful, but have you ever looked at how much it's costing you per person? And that income minimum comes up when you have a very small cohort of people, maybe people who you've served for a long time, and you have a knitting class that for some reason or another, the staff runs and the staff time is part of the overhead, plus the overhead for the library, and there's the same 3 people who come every week and have been coming for years, even though that money and time could be used to serve 15 people or 20 or 25. Now, some people say that you can't measure that kind of quality and what does it mean for those 3 people, but you're also a steward of public resources. You're also a steward of tax money, of the donations that people give you. And sometimes we find that we have this little cohort either of staff people or of people we serve, and we don't really look at the economics. And sometimes it can be heartbreaking. But what I look at are who are the new people that we're serving and how many and how is that shifting? And maybe there's a different way that we can do the same thing for those people. You know, maybe it's not about knitting. Maybe they're lonely and maybe they need more social activities they can do. Maybe there's other ways that we can make this a win-win situation. Timelines, checkpoints, and deadlines. Do we know what the expectation is about when something is supposed to be finished? And if it's an ongoing project like cataloging, for example, what is our reasonable expectation? Because we can now do that, compare what we do in terms of cataloging, if that's part of what our library does, with libraries from within the United States who are our size and serve the same number of people who have and have a similar amount of books in our collection. Almost every library I've ever visited has told me we're unique. Well, it's true that every human being is unique, but there's certain things people have in common. You know, like it's not good to drink straight bleach. That's something we all have in common. That a so-called quote healthy diet is better for most of us. So yes, everybody's unique, but nobody's special. And one of the advantages of living in the 21st century is seeing how other people do things. Now, I've heard this several times from library people I've worked with who have served in the military before they have worked for a library. And I have heard from these, and particularly military people or people who have worked in big corporations or have worked in fields where there's tight deadlines, and they say that one of the things, although they love libraries, that drives them crazy about libraries is the lackadaisical attitude to getting work done. There is no sense of, and I'm quoting now, no sense of urgency about getting work done. And so people get kind of complacent, a little smug about what goes on. And I, in my past, worked in retail, I've had a checkered past. And one of the things I did was I sold women's clothing at the old Gimbel's department store in New York City, in Manhattan, at the holiday season. And I'll tell you, folks, I have visited libraries in every state of the union, big ones, little ones, whatever. I have never been in a library that was as busy as that Christmas time selling frenzy that I experienced as a sales gal at Gimbel's. And I wonder sometimes, you know, about one issue is we don't have any way of saying this is our expectation. And let's make a guess if we can serve more people or if we can get the job done quicker. Quality, and this is probably the absolutely hardest thing to deal with out of the whole program today, has to do with that level of quality. And what does the word quality mean when we're talking about things that we believe to be intangible? How do we measure them? How do we describe them? How do we evaluate them? And the main thing that comes up is the difference between people who are the perfectionists versus people who say, let's get the job done within the resources we have. And one way I describe perfectionism when we talk about quality is people who don't know that there's a time-space continuum and they don't know that there's budgets, that they think that the time people spend on doing something on a payroll is somehow free and doesn't impact how much money that the library has to spend on other things. And one of the things I've noticed when you start using project management principles about things like budget and quality to how you do your work it can be a real eye-opener. And you know what? It's a way of legitimately finding more money in budgets. Sometimes when people do project management evaluations, people say, oh, it's just a way to fire people. The truth is, if it's done well, it's a way not only to keep people, but to find money to hire more people. But the kind of lackadaisical, if you want to call it, um, way that people do things, people aren't lazy, but it's sort of like they've got accustomed to kind of a laid back, easy way of doing things, which is terrific, but it doesn't get the job done. And it's, by the way, I want to make it clear, it doesn't have to do with age. You would have loved to hire my mom when she was 80 years old. She had been, among other things, a secretary and an office manager for years, had several jobs like that. And whenever she'd come out from Wisconsin to visit me in Denver, she immediately would come in, drop her luggage, and she'd say, okay, kids, let me help. And I'd give her things to do, and she would do them in a fraction of the time of people a third of her age. She loved keeping busy. She loved being productive. And that's the kind of people we need to hire as well. Ethics. And the way that I talk about library ethics, I talk about four main principles: equal access to the information, fair treatment for all people, transparency of process, and privacy for library users and readers as well. So the question is what we're doing falling into that? Are there any legal things that we have to do? And usually it might mean a contract we have that all the people in our consortium will catalog the same way. That's a legal thing. Or are there legal rules that we have to follow based on the larger institution that we serve? And finally, standards. What are the productivity benchmarks that we've set up? So those are the parameters. Remember, they're not goals. They are guidelines of these are the thou shalt nots that we don't cross over the curb. In fact, one library director who used to use this, who was the uh, library director in Santa Fe, New Mexico, she would tell her staff, I want you to drive on the road, don't drive the car up on the curb. And she would make a sketch to talk about these parameters. So there's lots of different ways of discussing them. So what would be hard about setting these professional parameters? What is it that people say when you're thinking about, again, the big ones: quality, time, budget, um, the idea of ethics, of there being some standardization within which we work, which isn't the same as exactly how we do everything, right? What are the standards? So let's take a look at what some of your colleagues say, but do feel free to type things. Yes, it takes too much time. There's a thing in project management called overhead, management overhead, the time it takes to build the framework for success. And to me, it's like building a house. That you want to make sure the foundation is in place and the framework for the house is working, and then you can work within the house. I would say that I'm thinking out loud, probably about 80% of the time when I'm working with a library where there's a lot of problems in terms of productivity and reaching goals and expectations, that these things are not in place. So people say, I don't have time to do them, but the truth is doing these things is one of the things that leads to success. So what do people say? Deciding what quality means, and that can take, in a healthy organization, not days or weeks, it can take months. Getting people on the same page and deciding what you're going to do with the person who says, I don't care, I've been doing this for 25 years. Enforcing the quality standards when people disagree, yeah, that's a hard one. Dealing with perfectionists. The administration is secretive about money and budgets. I've run into that a lot. And we don't have a way to establish deadlines or standards. Maybe we're not permitted to, maybe there isn't support from the administration or leadership. We believe that there's no way of doing it, but trust me, people are figuring out ways to do it that are not onerous at all. So here's some caveats we should pay attention to. If we have 43 parameters, yep, it's another way to micromanage for sure. So keep this simple. The fact that quality is subjective, so at some point we make a decision based on what the group, the library, the work team has decided. And it isn't one person's decision. we do have to sometimes compromise in terms of the goals of the group. And those decisions have to align with the larger library and institution that we serve as well. So here's the part that I love, that I spend the most time with, and this is the idea of the parameters having to do with civility and what civility means. That if I could have a tattoo, I would have a tattoo that would say civility is as important as ability. That being, and you would think that we wouldn't have to talk about this in a state like South Carolina that's known for manners and civility and kindness and respect. However, trust me, it's something that still can slip between the cracks. No exception means that if you have someone who's worked for the library who's rude, who's worked for the library for 40 years, I hope you finally decide that they don't work for the library anymore. And it's pretty basic. You know, it's the manners are rituals of respect. And that's true for every civilization, for every tribe on this planet. And in Western civilization, they're based on treating people as equals. So we don't have to go into this in detail, but what can be hard about setting behavioral standards? Now, in the places I've worked and the places I've run, we have a simple thing, which is if you aren't able to say hello, goodbye, please, thank you, good morning, and smile at people in a pleasant way, you don't get to work for me. It's as simple as that. I'm sorry, grumps are too costly in a service business, and you folks are in a service business. But what could be hard about setting some of these? Um, Employees who think they don't have to be polite because they work in the back room, so they're rude to each other. People who think it doesn't apply to them because they're special. And people say it's too subjective. Well, you know what? It isn't. We have developed more and more ways of talking about these things where you can say, yes, I can describe in an objective way what it means to be a polite person. And if you choose not to do this, you're telling me you don't want to have to work here anymore. So how are these models evaluated with the goals? And we'll do this quickly. This is our repeating what we did at the beginning, folks. This is the wrap up. Oversight is based on what gets done to reach the prioritized goals within the two parameters, the parameter of budget and time and quality and so on, and civility. And how this is accomplished is called style. So I'd like to share with you some books and authors who I think might be useful as you explore this more. And I'd like to turn this back over to Tiffany and see if we have any questions that I missed as we were presenting or any other questions that came up.
I don't see any specific questions. What questions do we have for the presenter?
Or comments.
Comments, thoughts? No? Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording then. If you find that you have any questions after the fact, let me know. We will be sending the recording out. Thank you for joining us.